he shares his perspective on how the similarities gave rise to our nation's most hallowed ground, Arlington National Cemetery. This book was the winner of the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award, and the award is named for the first published African-American female writer and is given to literary work that transcends culture, boundary, and perception. So that gives you an idea of where Mr. Murphy is coming from. He is the National Vice President for History for the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. He is an award-winning author, as I've mentioned, and he explores the rich tapestry of African-American history by weaving together the personal and heroic stories of amazing men and women and their rich and remarkable contributions to American history. His publications include The Arrival of the First Africans in Virginia in 1619, and the biography of Rear Admiral Larry Chambers, U.S. Navy, the first African-American to command an aircraft carrier. He has a master's degree from Boston University, and you might hear a little Boston in his voice. And he has a bachelor's degree from the University of Massachusetts. So again, let me welcome Mr. Murphy and let you know that if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat room to let us know what they are. And then after Mr. Murphy is done speaking, then we will address those questions, and then we will open up the microphone, so to speak. And if you have any additional questions, we can talk further. So with that.
And I'm going to.
The first military burial at Arlington National Cemetery took place on May 11, 1864, in that part of the cemetery that is known today as Section 27. That starts our journey into the evolution of Arlington Plantation, sometimes referred to as the Custis Lee Plantation at Arlington Heights, Virginia, to becoming America's most hallowed grounds. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an educator by training, a businessman by vocation, an author by passion, a historian by curiosity, and a genealogist by birth. The story of Arlington starts with a nation at war, a deadly civil war. And as an educator and historian, I felt it was important to tell the complete and untold story of Arlington National Cemetery's Section 27. I co-wrote the book with Tim Stevens, who at the time lived near the north gates of the cemetery and would often walk through Section 27. He noticed all of the civilian names and invited me on a walking tour of that section. It was from this tour that I knew that this was a little known story of an extremely important American landmark, and I had to write this story. Section 27 is the first burial section of Arlington National Cemetery. It also contains the untold story of African-American men, women, and children, and how their enslavement led to the sanctification of Arlington National Cemetery as America's most cherished hallowed ground. For my presentation, my robust objectives are: describe the public health emergency in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War and the effects on Arlington Plantation, illustrate the root causes and conditions of Washington's public health emergency, describe the challenges confronting the stewards of Arlington Plantation, how the plantation was used to mitigate the District of Columbia's public health challenges for soldiers and civilians, and the correlation between Arlington Section 27 and COVID-19, and try to do this all within a 40 to 45 minute period. First, the background of Arlington. The property was known as the Arlington Plantation, and the manor home was known as Arlington House. The land was used as a camp, a picnic ground, a freeman's village, which included a hospital and a church, an agricultural farm and defensive fort. The cemetery was formalized on May 13, 1864, and currently covers 639 acres of the original 1,100 acres. In order to understand the evolution from a plantation to hallowed grounds, we need to understand the role of three generals and their direct and indirect role on the original plantation and its correlation to today's global pandemic, COVID-19. The three generals are Confederate General Robert E. Lee, General Benjamin Butler, and General Montgomery Meigs. Let's first start with General Robert E. Lee. Arlington Plantation was the property that was owned by George Washington Parke Custis, the grandson of Margaret Custis Washington and the adopted son of George Washington, President of the United States. The property was willed to his daughter, Mary Custis Lee, as a lifetime inheritance, and her husband was Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee never owned the property. At the start of the Civil War, Lee resigned from the United States Army and denounced his U.S. citizenship. He was then commissioned as a general to lead the Confederate Army of Virginia of the Confederate States of America. When the war broke out, the Lee family left the plantation, and the Union Army took control of the property in securing the defenses of the nation's capital city, Washington. The roles of General Benjamin Butler and General Montgomery Meigs will be discussed later. They both had direct and indirect impacts on the property resulting from the emerging health crisis in the city of Washington, D.C., and the realization during the Civil War that Black lives mattered. While some may think that the term Black Lives Matter is a relatively new phenomenon, it was as important then as it is now during our current national health crisis and racial discord. During this period of coronavirus known as COVID-19, we're living in a consequential moment in American history. This is the period of time that will be recorded as a profound moment in American history and will be a period that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren will read about in their history books. As a result of COVID-19, the economic foundation of our country has been compromised. The foundation of our economy has been shattered with over 15 million people out of work, thousands upon thousands a day stand in food lines, and entire industries and businesses have collapsed. Our healthcare system is on the brink of a potential meltdown. Our families have been estranged, and our sick and vulnerable die alone. Today, COVID-19 has shown the inequities of our legal system, our economic and political system, and of our healthcare system. COVID-19 has laid bare the painful truths of these inequities as demonstrated by the total lives lost and the disparate losses of life within the African-American communities across this nation. This is not the first time that our nation has been confronted with events of a consequential nature. There have been other events in our young nation's history that had a profound impact on our citizenry. Our founding fathers revolted from the British Empire to forge a new nation with the basic mantra that all men are created equal. Our nation's original sin, slavery, divided the country on the issue of race, and we fought each other in a costly and deadly civil war. The period of the Civil War was a time period in which our nation was bitterly divided over issues of human dignity, a racial divide, classism, regional and political beliefs and economies, not much different than the political and regional differences that divide us today. Slavery was the economic engine that fueled the modern world. From the mid-1600s to the end of the period known as antebellum slavery, Americans of African descent were enslaved and their lives were overvalued for their free labor and used as assets to build great wealth for individuals, organizations, and governments. And after the Civil War, the lives of enslaved Americans of African descent were then devalued by society, by laws and social mores. The transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced movement of people in world history. It took place approximately from 1545 to 1860, 315 years in total. By the numbers, over 12 million captives were forcibly taken from Africa. Only 10 million reached their intended port of call. More than 15% of the human cargo was lost to history. And although we have over 44 million Americans of African descent today, and approximately 40 million European Americans who also have African ancestry, only 388,747 reached English North America, the United States of America. The enslaved were collateral for mortgages and loans. Banks in 1850 seized approximately 1,250 slaves when plantation owners defaulted on their loans. Insurance companies insured the lives of slaves and reimbursed slave owners when their slaves died. Slave states were overrepresented in the Congress because of the non-voting slaves. And by 1860, there were 3,953,000 slaves in the United States, 12.6% of the population. And expansion was by birth, not by import. And this peculiar institution, while only 344,000 arrived in English North America, the United States, over a 200-year period, between 1805 and 1860, 1.5 million Americans of African descent were sold south to the deep south from the northern states. Profits from enslavement were tremendous. President Abraham Lincoln made numerous proposals to pay slaveholders for their enslaved people. The last time he did this was as late as February 1865. The total value of the enslaved was estimated to be $4 billion at the start of the war. Slavery was estimated to have extracted 222,505,409 free slave hours from the enslaved. And the compounded value of this labor is equivalent to $100 trillion in 2020 terms. The enslavement of men, women, and children was big business that fueled the economy of the South and of the world. The notion that the Civil War was about states' rights is a false narrative. The Civil War was about the retention of the institution of slavery because it was big business and there was tremendous money to be made. At the start of the Civil War, the military came to DC. Battle casualties waited for military care on the battlefields. More serious victims were sent to makeshift hospitals in and around Washington. Fatalities were buried on the fields of war. Other fatalities were sent to Washington. The city was unable to accommodate all of the war dead. City services could not provide sufficient water for the quickly expanded population. The police department could not handle the rowdy behavior often associated with young men in uniform. And excrements left from animals entering the city promoted a growing rodent population, which concerned everyone. Stench during the summer months of amputated arms and legs stored in public view was unbearable and concerned public health officials. Estimates of 3,900 to 15,000 sex workers spread across the city. Barges along the Potomac, loaded with dead bodies, the city quickly ran out of space to bury the war dead and civilians. And housing could not accommodate the new residents. Makeshift shanties sprung up all across the city. And this became compounded by decision where the contraband of the military became another major onslaught of people entering the city. On May 24th, 1861, Major General Benjamin Butler refused to return 3 enslaved men to their slaveholder, a direct violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. General Butler utilized a military term and deemed the men as contraband of war. Within 10 weeks, 900 enslaved had reached safety behind Butler's lines once the word got out. Washington became a city of refuge. Fortifications and barracks, including those on Arlington Heights, ringed the city. According to J.D. Dickey in The Empire of Mud, barracks peppered the hillsides. Hospitals occupied public spaces. Nearby cemeteries began filling up, and camps for runaway slaves sprung up in ever larger numbers. As the dead, the sick, and maimed were sent to Washington, it quickly became a city with a healthcare system on the brink of collapse, similar in nature to the challenges faced by small and rural communities across the nation today, suffering under the weight of COVID-19. From 1861 to 1865, the duration of the Civil War, more than 2% of the American men died or were killed, and twice as many deaths were from infections than were from bullets. In 1861, the medical system was one of disarray, or non-existent. There were less than 100 surgeons in the United States Army, and there was a poor understanding of the anatomy, and medical schools were frequently afoul of the law for body snatching of graves. And medicine was largely provided only to the middle and the upper classes. There were no nursing schools or public health schools, and the care of the sick was primarily left to women at home. And Florence Nightingale had just recently published her notes on nursing in 1861. As a result of the Civil War, there were in fact military medical innovations. There was battlefield triage ambulance systems, surgical and amputation techniques and better anatomical understanding developed, embalming techniques for those bodies sent home for burial, and massive expansive of mobile field and hospital system and capacity. And prior to the war, hospitals were known as places to die. That changed, they became places to live. For the escaped contraband that eventually found their way to Washington, D.C., most of them came from the plantations of Virginia and Maryland. Conditions were so poor on those plantations, particularly as the war progressed. The escaped were so tired, hungry, and malnourished that many who fled died on the side of the roads alone. They encouraged their family to continue without them before getting caught. And unfortunately, many never got to see their day of freedom. Conditions in DC were horrendous. Being Black was dangerous to your health. The Black codes and curfews still prevailed. Random racially motivated violence and lack of access to the justice system dramatically impacted the safety of the contraband. Food was scarce and expensive, and traditional systems of self-care nursing were disrupted. The survivors of the long journey were often herded into concentration-type camps with little food or water to sustain themselves. Women and children were often preyed upon. Assistance was limited to charitable relief agencies. There was no plan for Blacks that were not useful to the military effort. There was a poor understanding of civil military disease transmission. And because of the war effort, the war did not leave space for civilian health and the needs of those Blacks formerly enslaved who came north. Camps in the city provided wage-based employment to build trenches, fortifications, and service in kitchens and hospitals for those who were lucky to find it. Camp Barker, near Logan Circle, present day, was a notorious plague center. 1,400 formerly enslaved men, women, and children arrived just in September 1862 alone. According to the Freedmen's Bureau, the shanty towns were nothing better than propagating grounds of crime, disease, and death. Health conditions had gotten so bad in Washington that the city was on the verge of exploding. The military looked to Arlington Heights as a solution. Arlington became a refuge from the bottomland and human waste running in the streets of DC. Health was associated and ascribed to the trees, the fertile land, and the fresh water on the heights. A decision was made to erect military housing for the contraband at Arlington Plantation. Freeman's Village became a planned community, was established by the federal government in 1863 on the grounds of the Custis Lee Plantation. The village was a collection of 50 1.5-story houses. Each house was divided in half to accommodate 2 families. Freeman's Village was a huge success. It helped the formerly enslaved integrate into a free society with wage-based income. It promoted self-sufficiency by training former enslaved as skilled laborers. It included an industrial school, schools for children, a hospital, a home for the aged, and churches. In my book, Section 27, Freeman's Village, I go into great lengths in describing how it was a huge success and all of the factors that helped become so. Residents had access to improved air, access to food, access to a medical facility, and access to religious services. They also had access to job training and employment opportunities, which helped to reduce mortality compared to the fugitive enslaved who remained in Washington, D.C. The last of the Civil War generals that had a profound impact on Arlington Plantation and the transformation from an agricultural farm to hallowed grounds was Brigadier General Montgomery Meigs. A staunch Unionist, Meigs disliked the Confederacy and developed a strong disdain for his former mentor, Robert E. Lee, for deserting the United States Army. As U.S. Army Quartermaster General, Meigs was charged with finding additional space to bury all of the Union dead soldiers. He turned to the land at Arlington Heights as a logical solution. The location was perfect. It was high above the flood lines. It was close to Washington, allowing Meigs easy access to monitor results, and it was the home of his once close friend, now Confederate enemy, Confederate Robert E. Lee. Present-day 27 was originally a pauper cemetery, and this is where the first military were buried. As poor Civil War dead arrived from the battlefields in Washington, around Washington, D.C., the unfortunate fallen were sent to Arlington Plantation in what became a potter's field. As more and more families unable to have the bodies of their family members sent home, the potter's field slowly grew with an alarming number of very young and poor white soldiers. The first to be buried was Private William Henry Chrisman from the 67th Pennsylvania Infantry, first military serviceman interred in Arlington National Cemetery was on May 13, 1864. But Section 27 quickly became the final resting place for the war refugees, who were growing in numbers. As medical conditions in Washington worsened, indigent contraband were buried at Arlington. Nearly 3,800 citizens or contrabands are interred in Section 27, and the word citizen or civilian is now inscribed on their headstones. What I would like to do at this point in time is introduce you to some of those who are buried in Section 27. In Arlington National Cemetery, every man, woman, and child buried there is an honored citizen. There are American presidents there, statesmen, scholars. Section 27 also has some notable people there as well. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Martha Washington are buried in Arlington's Section 27. No, not the 2 presidents and the First Lady, but 3 honored African Americans, citizens who have the name of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Martha Washington. It was not unusual for the formerly enslaved upon their day of freedom to adopt a name of someone famous with whom they felt was important enough in society that they too would become important. There was a John Adams who's a citizen, Thomas Jefferson who's a citizen, even James Monroe, a citizen. And each of these enslaved men were named after presidents, or upon their day of freedom, took the names of prominent men, United States presidents. I now understand how my co-author, Tim Stevens, when he first went to walk through Arlington National Cemetery and went through the North Gate, became enamored with Section 27. When you see the rows upon rows of names of enslaved men, women, and children, you can't help feel the challenges that they went through, and for those few who survived, the perseverance that they had to have had. Headstone upon headstone, it's absolutely remarkable as to the challenges that they went through, but that they also found their way to what is now known as our nation's most hallowed ground. But the story doesn't end there. On the other side of the road, from the contraband section of Arlington National Cemetery, Section 27, are 1,800 men of African descent, Americans of African descent, who served in the United States Colored Troops. They went to war to preserve the Union, to protect the United States, and to free the enslaved. Row upon row, we now find these young, brave Black men who went in a war to risk their own lives and for many their own freedoms, to go south to Maryland and Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky to fight in the Civil War. We also find in Section 27, 4 men who received the Medal of Honor. 3 of those men, Americans of African descent. Thomas Shaw, from Sergeant Company K, the 9th U.S. Cavalry, fought in the Indian Wars. William Brown fought in the U.S. Navy. And James Harris, Sergeant Company B in 38th United States Colored Troops. With the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, we've come to realize the importance that Black lives matter. It's interesting as to how important Black lives matter during the Civil War. Black lives were the result of the Civil War. As we begin to look at our health system today, its basic foundations is predicated on what was learned during the Civil War as a result of the medical emergencies in the greater Washington area. When we look at the health emergency in Washington during the Civil War and its effects on Arlington Plantation, we can easily draw parallels, not 100%, but we certainly can draw parallels in terms of what happened in Washington with the enslaved and how they went to Arlington either as residents of Freeman's Village or as those interred in Section 27. The root causes and conditions of Washington's public health emergency is very similar to the emergencies that small communities, villages, rural America, even the large cities today are being confronted with COVID-19. Our healthcare system is being overwhelmed, much as it was during the 1860s in Washington. The stewards of Arlington Plantation had many challenges. I didn't go into great detail about General Robert E. Lee or the Lee family and the challenges that they were confronted with before the war, during the war, and after the war in terms of the ownership of the property. But the property, without any question, was used to mitigate the District of Columbia's public health challenges for soldiers and civilians. There clearly is correlation between Arlington's Section 27 and COVID-19, particularly when you realize that the question of the value of African-American life, either then or now. While the property was known as Arlington Plantation, we've come to know it as Arlington National Cemetery. There are many other hidden stories that you'll find in the book that I didn't elaborate that much upon. General Meigs was clearly a very interesting character. His role in the formation of Arlington National Cemetery, his hatred for his once best friend, Robert E. Lee, drove him to perhaps design the most important hallowed ground in America. And when General Meigs lost his son in the Civil War, he blamed the Confederacy and worked that much harder to make sure that the Lee family would not be able to return to their beloved home. He wanted to poison the wells so that the land would be unusable for anyone to live there again. The first burial on May 13th, 1864, started the burial of over 400,000 men, women, and children, and with more to come as America fights many wars in the future. So I hope you've found some interest in this presentation. I hope you got something out of it. And more important, I hope you buy the book, Section 27, Freeman's Village, the most hallowed ground in America. At the end of this presentation, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have, and hopefully I've stirred up a lot of controversy here, so you've got some good questions for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Murphy.
That's
So
Rick.
we have a couple questions here. And I think you may have actually answered it. What is the difference between a citizen and a civilian on the grave markers? And I think you may have mentioned it, but
no, I didn't.
Okay.
There's really no distinction, and I've asked that question as well. Why did they use citizen and why did they use the civilian? No one has a real answer to that. When the contraband were buried, they were buried with wooden crosses. When the crosses began to rot, they contracted out to different granite companies to make the stones. And some of the stones came in different lots from different companies. And what they said was some companies use the word civilian, some companies use the word citizens. So, but there was no rhyme or reason as to the difference between a civilian and a citizen.
Okay, well, thank you. Another question is, how much cooperation did you get from the commanders or the managers of Arlington National Cemetery?
As an author, I have about 6 books that are in the hopper. And many of these books are very controversial. And I have learned to do my research before I start asking any questions. If I start asking questions early on, then I get no cooperation from anybody. Once they came to understand that I had a lot of information, everybody was very, very helpful. Most of them had not been asked any questions about Section 27 other than why all those names with civilian and citizens on it. So no one had done any in-depth research. There are a couple of books out there that might have half a chapter or something, but there really isn't a lot of data on it, other than a couple of scholarly research projects that were funded by different organizations. So I did get an awful lot of support from the military there at Arlington.
That's
good
good
question.
To know. That's good to know. We have a question from Lynn Borton, and Lynn, you might want to help me out with this question. You ask about the Arlington, she understands that some of the formerly enslaved people who had lived at Arlington Plantation are buried there now. Is that correct? And do you know how that was decided? Meaning,
okay.
I think, Lynn, if you want to jump in here, what was decided? Who to bury there?
Oh, yeah. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I understand there was at least one man formerly
Correct.
enslaved on the plantation who was actually helpful in some of the reconstructing the history
James
around
Parks.
the plantation. Yes, and that he's buried there. And I wondered if there were others as well.
Okay. There's a two-part answer to that. And you've actually answered one part of it, but let me deal with the other part. Prior to the Civil War, the enslaved that were at Arlington Plantation, when they died, they were buried in a slave plantation. The slave plantation was close to the Syphax property. I don't know if any of you know anything about the Syphaxes. Maria Syphax was the illegitimate daughter of George Washington Parke Custis. So she was half sister to Mary Custis Lee. At the time when she reached about, I think, 25 or 27, George, her father, gave her 17 acres of land, which was within the parameters of his property. It's generally around the area where the Sheraton Hotel is right now. So when you see a map, you'll notice an indentation into Arlington. That was the Syphax property. That also was approximate area where the Custis enslaved were buried. After the war, many of them continued, during the war, many of them continued to be buried in that part. But again, at that point, it was outside of the parameters of Arlington National Cemetery. There was one honor, however, given to James Parks. James Parks was an enslaved man born on the property. As a young man, he was a grave digger and buried, or was part of the burial groups for most of the burials on Arlington Cemetery. Many of the trees that were buried in the 1860s, 1870s, the late 1880s were actually planted by James Parks. Upon his death, they gave him the distinct honor to be buried, and I believe he's buried in section 17. But in the book, I'd have to look it up. I believe he's buried in section 17. So he is the only enslaved person after the war that was buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
So thank you. The next question we have is from June, and she asks, is section 27 covered in any exhibit at the Smithsonian's African American Heritage Museum?
That's a good one. And I've covered that museum so many times, and I'm going to, this is like a Jeopardy question. And I'm going to err on the side and saying yes. But if it is mentioned, it's a minor mention and not a major mention.
I see. Fair enough. Allison Finkelstein says, thank you for the great lecture. She is a historian at Arlington Cemetery, and she says that this summer they released a new education module about the African American experience at Arlington National Cemetery, and it includes a lesson plan on section 27. Allison, that's great news. She's including a link in the chat area, so if anybody wants to take a look at that, you can click on it right there. We will also include it in posts on our website. So that's good to know, Allison. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison.
Does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Murphy?
Either I did a really good job or I did a very bad job. And again, I apologize for the confusion. But again, family circumstances today kind of messed me up.
It was very interesting. Thank you so much.
Where is section 27 actually located?
It's on the most northwest portion of the cemetery. You know where the Iwo Jima Memorial, no, not the Iwo Jima Memorial.
The Netherlands Carillon.
Yes, yes. It's located across the street from there.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Another way of putting it, it's that part of the property that's furthest away from the mansion.
So Rod Mackler asks about the desegregation of the cemetery. The cemetery was segregated until President Truman. And then when he desegregated it, was that the point that the cemetery was also desegregated? Could you talk more about that?
Yes. We look at cemeteries today very differently than the way that cemeteries were looked at in the 1800s and the 1900s. In life, as well as in death, everything was segregated, particularly in the South. And as a result of that, those who were Black or enslaved were always buried as far away from a white cemetery. So to go back to the previous question, if you look at the furthest part of the property, you would bury the enslaved as far away as you could. And that's why it's in the most northern portion of the cemetery. When the United States colored troops began to be buried there, many of their families who came to Washington, and again, many of these families were free people of color, when they came to Washington, they were furious to see the conditions of Arlington's Section 27. And it wasn't called that. It was actually called, I believe, the Contraband Cemetery. They wanted to have their loved ones reinterred with the other men who were in the cemetery. They also became very angry when they began to realize that at a certain point, they were beginning to bring in Confederate soldiers into Arlington Cemetery. And they were appalled that their sons who fought to preserve the Union and to free the enslaved were treated in death in a worse way than they were treated in life. They put up such a stink that they began to fill in between the two cemeteries and make them as one cemetery. But they continued to take out the white bodies and reinter them in other places and backfill them with people of color, African Americans.
We have another question from, this one from Charlie Clark. Is there some confusion about where exactly the location of Freedman's Village is?
Up until about 5 years ago, I think there was some confusion as to where Freedman's Village was. Unfortunately, and to this day, I don't understand why. And I think more and more people, as they get interest on this, are asking why there is no marker inside the cemetery that shows where Freedman's Village was. None. Now, the bridge that they put up there, they've got the marker there that says Freedman's Village. And I think that's somewhat added to the confusion. But there were some that believed that Freedman's Village was closer to the water and not as high up on the land as it was. The reason for that is many who lived in Freedman's Village, particularly the women and the young people, worked on the farms, and the agricultural farms were closer to the water. So when they did some excavation, they found some things there and they said, oh, this must be where Freedman's Village was. But if you look in some of the more period documents, Freedman's Village was actually closer to the Syphax property, much further up on the hill. And my brain is fried right now. The African-American who went to the North Pole.
Harry.
I'm sorry?
Harry.
Yes, Perry. When you find out where his cemetery plot is, that's the approximate location of where Freedman's Village stood.
Oh, okay.
It was actually Matthew Henson you were trying to think of.
Matthew Henson, that's it. Matthew Henson.
Oh, it's Perry was the way it was Henson.
Matthew Henson. And while I'm talking, what I'll do is I'll see if I'll pull up the picture that's in the book that shows you exactly where Henson was with Perry. Yeah, Matthew Henson.
Okay, well,
and it's pretty interesting. I know I got the picture in the book here someplace. Not that picture. So why don't you ask the next question? I'll see if I can find the picture.
All right, well, the next question comes from Eric, and he is talking about the stone wall that's pictured behind you and pictured on the cover of your book.
Yes.
I think he says that the wall was built by Harry Gray, who was also a former slave at the plantation. Is this true? And do you have any information about Mr. Gray?
Unfortunately, I do not. I didn't pursue that line there.
I know that Harry Gray was in fact a mason, a brick mason, because he also collected bricks for his own house, which is on Columbia Pike. I don't know too much else about Mr. Gray, but we can do some research and we can post it on the website and fill you in.
Okay, so I don't know if you can see this or not. Is that easy to see?
It's a map. That's about it.
Okay, so you can kind of see the configuration of the original plantation, but hopefully this map here will show you in better stead, and I'll point my finger here, and you'll notice the indentation. That's where approximate the Sheraton Hotel is. That was the Syphax property. And you can see right here, and that's where Freeman's Village is. So it's close up to the hill, closer to the fort.
It's definitely going to be. We're going to have to buy that book.
That's why you do small maps.
Yeah. Okay, so Carl asks, he has a map drawn in 1888 that shows the exact location of Freedman's Village within the cemetery. That's good to know. Okay, good. Carl, we will look forward to you sharing that with us in the future. Okay, do we have any other questions?
And I think at this time, if anybody wants to unmute and ask anything or say anything, that's fine also.
Now, in the book, there are a number of themes in the book that obviously I can't touch on everything here, but there are some very unique stories in the book. There are a number of unique stories about James Parks as an individual. There's a unique story, or several unique stories about Mariah Carter Syphax, her relationship with her father, her relationship with her half-sister. She was allowed to marry in the manor house, which was almost unheard of for a slave person to marry inside of a home of such a prominent family. There's a number of interesting anecdotes about the relationship between General Meigs and his once mentor, Robert E. Lee. So you'll find a number of themes. I write a chapter on the Confederate memorial that's there. I found that very interesting in terms of the relationship of how the Confederate memorial got there, as well as the cemetery directly located across from the memorial, and how there are United States colored troops there. And many felt that they would put there so they could keep a watchful eye on the Confederates. So there are a number of different stories in the book, and usually you can only write so many pages before the author the publisher tells you get too much, and I can only touch on a small piece here.
So, Mr. Murphy, I actually read your book, and it was really very interesting, and I believe, Annette, we do sell it in our bookstore now. Is that correct?
Correct.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You can get it through Arlington Historical Society, but I really thoroughly enjoyed learning all the details. I mean, I taught social studies, but I just had it's like, man, I wish I was still teaching. I could share some of this with my students. So
good.
Well done. And thank you for the presentation tonight.
Thank you. And that's how I try to write. Again, I'm a former educator, and I try to write about individuals and things that the average person doesn't think to write about because it's not important enough. But I usually find enough interesting facts that I say, gee, I think at least one person other than myself would be interested in this. So that's why I try to write those things. And the book I just had come out, the first Africans that arrived in 1619. I'm getting the same type of response from folks. Gee, I never knew that. You raised something that I never thought about before. I see how you can connect the dots. And like I try to do COVID-19, you know, oftentimes you'll hear people say, well, gee, we don't know why Black Lives Matter because it didn't matter before. And I like to say, yeah, but this particular event, there was all kinds of documentation why the Black lives in the area did mean something. So I try to do that.
Well, it is no wonder that you won the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award for this book.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for joining us. We hope your mother is feeling better.
Thank you.
We sincerely appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've all been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for joining.
And I'll log out because I know you guys are probably still going to conduct business. So I will mute.
Okay. Oh.
All right. And I thank you all this evening. Those of you that are still here, I'm going to go ahead and close out the event, and I will get the recording to the Benbow so it can be edited and put on our website eventually.
All right. Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Night, everyone.